Welcome to the Festival of Storytellers.
I thank everybody that's involved with this process, because we know writers need readers and writers need publishers.
Experience is not about the publisher, it is about us, the authors.
Good evening. I am so pleased to be here and given the opportunity to talk about my book. This is my book called Letters from World War II. This is a book that is about my parents and their experience during World War II. It is a biography. It is very historical in nature. It's a bit of a mystery in what happened to my dad during World War II and my mother, on the home front at home. And it is a book that I, to be quite honest, never really meant to write a book. Of all the things that I think I might have done in retirement, writing a book was not anywhere on my list. But things unfolded after my mother's death that made me want to know what happened. I am a child of post-World War II America. My parents were involved in World War II, but it's very, very interesting in that they never talked about their experiences. They never really sat us down and said, here's what happened to us during World War II. Growing up, we really didn't know what they went through. And I always say we didn't know what they went through. My family, and this story is in the book, my family celebrated Jump Day every January 11th from when I was a little kid to adulthood. And Jump Day was January 11th, and every January 11th, my dad would come down from upstairs and wave his hands and sort of go, it's Jump Day, let's have pancakes. And what we knew growing up on Jump Day was that our dad jumped out of an airplane with a parachute, and he landed in the snow and took off his parachute after he jumped, and he buried his parachute in the snow. And then he and the other guys from the plane started walking, and they were picked up, not captured. He never used the words captured. He was picked up by what he called were the German police. And after he was picked up by the German police, he went to prison camp and didn't come home till the end of the war. That is basically what we grew up knowing about our dad. We didn't know why he was on a plane. We didn't know why he had to jump out of the plane. And it's interesting, when we asked him about this prison camp, he never called it prison. He always called it prison camp. And he told us that he lived in a cabin and they slept on bunk beds and they cooked their own food, sometimes outside, and they played games to pass the time. So to my sisters and I growing up, it sounded an awful lot like summer camp. So he was in summer camp during the war. The point being, growing up, my sisters and I really didn't have any sense that maybe there was something bad about this, that maybe this wasn't a summer camp, that maybe bad things went on. We had no idea. As we got older, we of course understood that he was a navigator on a B-17 bomber and he was bombing Germany and his plane was shot down and he was captured in a German prison camp and then came home. So, growing up, we really did not have a sense at all from our parents that maybe these 4 years were horrific, or we just didn't, because they never talked about it. We would get comments from my dad. I remember another story that's in my book is we were sitting around one night watching the show Hogan's Heroes, and we were laughing, and my dad came into the TV room and stood for a couple minutes and he looked at the TV, and then he went over and he shut the TV off and he looked at us and said, "Don't ever watch this show. The German guards were not stupid. They were mean." And he walked out of the room. We were like, "What?" So growing up, we did not know the extent of the story or really what happened. So then what happened is my mother died and my sisters and I were cleaning out her house. And in the back of one of her closets, we found 2 boxes. They were about this big, one of them. I opened the first box and it was full of letters. And I looked at the dates of the letters, and they were all in these groups tied with ribbons. And the first group of letters was from Santa Ana Air Base. I knew my dad went to flight school in Santa Ana. The second group of letters were from England. And then the third group of letters were very strange. I picked one up, and I have an example here. This is, you can see the German on the front. And I looked at these. What are these letters? And they were from prison camp. I guess I never realized that my dad could write letters to my mother from this prison camp. But then at the time, I didn't even know how long he was in prison camp. I just knew that jump day was January 11th. So I took these boxes of letters, and there was another box, and it was full of the most incredible documents. They were an entire box, and they had flight records, telegrams from the War Department, medical records. They had these documents that were all in German from prison camp, and they were his prisoner of war records. They were all in German, and I had to find someone to translate them for me. And the person who translated them turned the front over to the back and said, "Oh, these are all punishments." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Well, this means that on these dates, your dad was punished for things." And that, I think, was the first sense that I got that maybe this prison camp experience was not a good thing. So I took all these documents home, and the first thing that I wanted to do was scan them all, because most of the letters from my dad were in pencil. They're 80 years old, and they were beginning to fade. And I thought, I better scan all this stuff into a digital file. And I started scanning these telegrams. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen a World War II telegram, but they're kind of on tissue-like paper, and they are not going to last a lot longer. They're 80 years old. So I started scanning all this stuff with a desktop scanner, and I realized I didn't even know what some of these documents were. And if I'm going to scan them into a file, I have to explain what they are, where they were, the dates, why he had these documents. One of the documents was a commendation from Winston Churchill for some flights that he was the lead navigator for. And it was a commendation from Navarro and from Winston Churchill. And I thought, oh, this is pretty cool, but I need to explain what it is. So what I found myself doing was writing a story about every document and every letter. And from there, it just grew into this huge file with stories and explanations about what these documents were. So then, after I went through some of these documents, one of the documents I found was a medical record for my dad from 1942 when he was at Santa Ana Air Base. And this medical record, I was looking at it and noticed that my dad, it listed his height and his weight was 164 pounds. He wasn't a big man. And then I picked up a medical record after the war, and my dad's weight was 114 pounds when he was in France. And then I sort of was like, why was he in France? How did he get to France? He was in a prison camp in Germany. Now he's in France, and he weighs 114 pounds. What? That's a 50-pound weight loss. Why? I didn't know. And there was also a notation on this medical record that all of his teeth would need to be pulled because they were rotted due to malnutrition. And when I started looking at those sorts of things, I began to get this sense that this prison camp was not a good thing, that some horrible things went on in this prison camp, meaning now I've found punishments and starvation and malnutrition. So I became very interested in putting the story together. And I started off with a timeline of, I guess when I started, I knew Jump Day was January 11th, but I really didn't know what year it was until I picked up the first telegram, and it said, to my mother, and it was dated January 26, 1944, and it said, the Secretary of War regrets to inform you that your husband, George Hannon, has been missing since January 11th. And that was on January 26th, 1944. So then I hunted through the box, and I found a second telegram that was dated February 18th, 1944. And it said, to my mother, your husband, Lieutenant George Hannon, has been reported a prisoner of the war of the Germans by the International Red Cross. And I looked at that and I said to one of my sisters, you know, Mom did not know that he was dead or alive for 37 days. You know, and I thought about that for the longest time. My mom, you know, she was a teacher in a high school here in Iowa. And I thought about my mom getting up every day, taking the bus to teach all day, coming home. She didn't know. She didn't know if he was dead or alive. And I suddenly realized that, you know, this World War II time for my parents was not a good time. And I thought about my mother. I hunted for a third telegram and I found it, and it was dated April 17th, 1944. So January to February to March to April, almost 4 months before my mother knew where he was. And it was a telegram that said he was a prisoner of war at Stalag Luft 1. And then it was another 2 months before my mother got a letter like this. It's very interesting, from my dad from prison camp, that said he was alive, he was safe. And that's about all he could say, because all of the mail from prison camp was highly censored by both governments. But I began to piece together this story, and I wanted to tell the story through the letters and match the letters that my mother wrote to what was going on and where he was, and try to explain in the book what was happening. And it took a tremendous amount of detective work in order to find out where he was, to find out what was going in this prison camp, how he was being treated. And there is actually a lot of information out there in the government archives with information about Stalag Luft 1 prison camp. One of the things I did was get on a plane and fly to England and meet the man who is the curator of the museum at Ridgewell Air Base in England, where he was stationed. And I spent a lot of time learning about what life was like on this air base, what it was like for my dad, how long he was there, and was stunned to see all the documents that they had over there. My dad's letters from England are really interesting in that the longer he is there and the more flights that he went on, he made it 16 missions at a time when you had to complete 25 in order to go home. And I matched the letters that he wrote my mother from England with his flight records and what was going on. And clearly, as time went on, my dad's letters are very poignant. He is clearly frightened. He writes to my mother things like, I signed up for this job. I will do it to the best of my ability, but every day I don't know what's going to happen, and my life hangs in the balance. So clearly, it was getting more frightening for my dad with each. And I never thought about my dad like that. Here's a picture of my mom and dad. This is my dad in his lieutenant's uniform, and my mom. This is their wedding picture, which I chose to put on the book. Other things that I had to put together that were just astonishing is my parents were married June 19th, 1943. And I found a letter in the box from August. And it was my dad's first letter from England. And he was telling her that he arrived safely. It was August 1943. So they had been married since June 19th. 2 months later, my dad is in England, and then he was shot down and captured. My mother did not see him for 2 years. And I thought about that. I never knew that. And as I began to put together this timeline, I think people today cannot understand what that's like, that your husband flies off in August, and then you don't know what happened to him, and you don't see him for 2 years. But the one thing that my parents did is write. They were just prolific writers. And my mother wrote these letters to my dad in prison camp that were positive. They were all about the future. They were, when this is over, we're going to have a great life together. Keep your head up. My mother wrote in one letter, You wait there, George, and I'll wait here. And one day we will never, ever, ever have to wait anymore. So they wrote these positive letters to keep each other's spirits up during the war. It was hard because it took 4 months for a letter from my mom to reach my dad in prison camp. And then it took 4 months for a letter that he wrote to get to her. So these letters, though they tried to carry on a conversation, it's clear in these letters that they could not really carry on a conversation. In one letter, my dad made it, he was a chess player, and he made it to the finals of the all-camp chess tournament. My mother got that letter 4 months later, and she immediately wrote, "Did you win?" But then it was 4 months until he got that letter. So the letters are very interesting in how they talk to each other. So the other fact was, after finding out how horrific this prison camp was, I looked at all these letters from France. And of course, I had no idea my dad was in France. I knew he was in a German prison camp, but I had no idea he was in France. And so that was another mystery that had to be investigated. And it is a most interesting story how my dad was rescued from this prison camp. So if you want to know how my dad got out of this prison camp, you got to read the book. The evacuation and rescue of the prisoners at Stalag Luft 1 in Germany is extremely interesting. It's well documented, but I think not well known. And that is because at the end of the war, that was Russian territory. So I was shocked when I got the story and put it together and found out how my dad got rescued from this prison camp and ended up in France. So I wrote the story. It took some time to make sure that I got the historical events correct, but I really wanted to tell the story through their letters and then match what was happening to what they were writing to each other. And overall, when I finished the book, I have such pride in my parents. I had no idea what they went through, and I am so touched by how they dealt with it. And you know, sometimes people today get so angry over the littlest things, and yet my parents, in their letters, there is never one word of anger. There is never one word of whining. Why me? Why did this happen to me? These letters are just full of strength, you know, a commitment of love to each other, a positive view to the future. And that's how they got through it. And I know, after knowing the whole story now, why my parents really never talked about it. I think once it was over, some of the horrors that they went through, they just sort of put out of their mind. But I wanted to write the book after I began to put all this information together. I just wanted whoever wanted to read about just an ordinary Midwest couple. They met when they were in junior high and stuck together for 40 some years after the war. Just an ordinary couple who extraordinary things happened to them. And I think the way they approached it and the way they lived through it is remarkable. And my parents are not much different than other members of the greatest generation who went through this. They sacrificed, they put their lives on hold, they never got angry, they never whined, protested against the government. They just quietly did their job. As my dad said, I signed up for this job no matter the outcome. And I think we can learn a lot from books like this in the way the Greatest Generation approached the war. So I'm very proud of the book. And if you want to read it, it's called Letters from World War II. And I think my parents are a pretty handsome couple, don't you think? So, does anybody have any questions for me? I would encourage anybody who comes across what we came across, and that's a treasure trove of letters, to investigate what was happening. I think the more stories that we put out there about World War II, we just cannot forget what this generation did. And I encourage anybody who has a story about their parents in World War II to get it down on paper and save it forever, so that we have a pretty good example of what this generation did. And I'm glad I wrote the book. And I just hope that people out there might want to read it. So, any other questions? Thank you for your comments about putting the letters together. It was, it was just really a love fest. I think sometimes you don't expect your parents to write the kind of letters that they wrote. And we were so touched by my parents' expressions of love to each other in these letters. And I think that I've learned a lot from them. So anyway, that is my story. Any other questions? Anybody want to know anything else? I was asked to talk about myself. I am a retired nurse. I was a nurse for 45 years. And actually, as a nurse, I worked in quality management, and I wrote a number of chapters and did a lot of writing, but never something that had this kind of emotion in it. Oh, when I was writing this book, I would discover something and cry for hours. Was there a time when you felt emotional? I think when I found out that this German on the back of my dad's prisoner of war records were punishments, where he was put in the cooler, or I'm not sure what the other punishments were. When I discovered that he had lost almost 50 pounds, so was starved in this prison camp, I think you never having known this, I look at my dad and think he went through this, and those were very emotional. Reading their letters to each other and how much they loved each other and couldn't wait to see each other again was highly emotional. Again, I think all of us have no idea, are not used to seeing these kinds of expressions from their parents. They're our parents. But thank you very much for listening to my little story today. And you might want to read my book, find out what happened. How did he get out of prison camp? So thanks. Oh, it was totally an emotional journey. How many moments of wishful thinking you had as you were going through all those records in your parents? It was totally an emotional roller coaster. Every time I would pick up something, I think the most emotional also was picking up this telegram that said, to my mother, the Secretary of War regrets to inform you that your husband, Lieutenant George Hannon, has been missing over Germany since January 11th. And I read that and I thought, well, how did my mother feel picking up that telegram and then every day maybe hoping there was another telegram, 37 days until she got this telegram that said that he was a prisoner of war. And I wish so much that I could have asked my mom, how did you feel? What did you do when you got this? I wish I could have asked her. I wish I could have asked her. But they never talked about it, and I never had the sense that this was anything bad. And I could have just asked her. She lived to be 93 years old. I could have asked her. But again, we shouldn't talk about it. And it wasn't sort of on my radar until I found the letters and the documents. Oh, I have every single letter and every single document, every single one of them. And I have scanned them all in a digital file so that they will be preserved. My mother's letters, actually, she had a fountain pen. So her letters are in good condition. My dad's letters from prison camp, all they had in this prison camp were nubby pencils, I think, and they are beginning to fade. And so I have digitally scanned them so that they will be preserved, which I would suggest people do when they're starting to write a historical book like that and have documents. The documents are extremely historical. I mean, it is rare to see every single one of my dad's flight records from England, where he went, how many hours he was flying, what his target was. Those are very historic. And of course, his prisoner of war documents are extremely historic. And they're most interesting, all of these documents, and they need to be preserved because it's a piece of history. So I have it all. I don't know who's going to get it after I'm gone, but one of his granddaughters, I'm sure, will want to keep them. So anything else? Can I tell you anything else? Many, many, many moments. Someone's asking how many moments of wishful thinking. Many moments. The whole writing the story was emotional. Every time I found something new or had to do some research and figure this out, I think when I got the macro report from the federal government, which was the missing aircrew report, I had to write and get it from the National Archives, explained exactly what happened to my dad's plane and how it was shot down and what happened. And when we were growing up, we asked my dad once if all the people on his plane got out. And he told us, he lied, and he said, oh yeah, everybody got out. Well, that wasn't true. The macro report, clearly their radio man was strafed and killed. I did not know that. And it was my dad who found him, slumped over his radio desk. The macro report said that they lost one engine, was shot, probably by fighter pilots. And then the second engine they lost. And then Flak got the rest of the plane. And they just had minimal seconds to jump out of this plane before it exploded. So they were lucky to get out, but I had no idea. Growing up with jump day with my dad saying, oh, I jumped out of a plane with a parachute. to finding out that they were under a pretty severe attack with flak and being chased by fighter pilots and shot at. And that was extremely emotional. So I had no idea. But you have to do your research and tell the story. So that's the story of what happened. Shocked that I was, because I just thought you just jumped out of a plane and landed in the snow, and not so. And I read a story about what it was like to fly day after day after day through flak exploding all around you. And I think of my dad. He did that. He was very brave, and very proud of him. Anything else? Is that it? Who's out there?